Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Danielle Flores Lopez. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve in two roles right now in NatSci. I serve as the Interim Assistant Dean of DEI and the Director of Academic Advising and Student Success Initiatives. I want to share that today's session will be recorded because there's many folks that can't join and would like this opportunity to learn more. And I will let RCPD team share in a minute if they are going to share their slides. But I want to thank you all for attending. And today we have the opportunity to, join in this space. And this session specifically is going to focus on compliance, how to implement accommodations, tips for trauma-informed practices in the classroom. Overall, we want to continue supporting our students, continue supporting each other, and continue to build that partnership with RCPD. So additionally, the DEI office hopes to have further conversations and presentations in the spring semester. We hope to have a student panel with both undergraduate and graduate students, and we also hope to bring in some speakers. So please look for more of that information coming soon. We want to thank our colleagues from RCPD who are joining us. Today we have with us Shelby Gombosi, Lindsay Hill, and Tesia Freer. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to them.
Thanks, Danielle. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Shelby. I am the Assistant Director here at the Resource Center for Persons with Disabilities, or RCPD, and have Lindsay and Tesia here with me to kind of talk a little bit primarily about the accommodations part of everything. We'll go over a little bit about MSU's disability and reasonable accommodations policy, but for the most part, we'll be talking about the actual accommodations and implementing accommodations, tips for how to do that, and tips for, as Danielle mentioned, the trauma-informed practices in the classroom, things like that. We'll try to keep it brief because I know we have an hour and everybody's very busy. So I am going to share screen. I'll need a couple of thumbs up to let me know when you can see. Can you see that okay? Great, thank you, appreciate that. And then that moved all over the place, so I have a couple screens up, so I have to get my bearings for a minute. And then we'll move to the next slide.
Great, awesome. So I'm going to get us started today. Again, my name is Tesia Freer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the blindness and visual impairment specialist at RCPD. I also serve some other populations, but that's my primary role. So thank you for having us here today. We're excited to talk with you. So as Shelby mentioned, we're going to do a little overview of the MSU Disability and Reasonable Accommodations Policy, which is super fun, but very important. So we'll go over that and then get into more specifics on accommodations after that. So the Disability and Reasonable Accommodation Policy prohibits discrimination and harassment against a qualified individual with a disability. The policy describes the process for seeking reasonable accommodations to ensure equal employment opportunities and equal access to university program services and facilities. So, we can't discriminate against anyone based on disability status, and we have to make sure that everybody has access to what they need and everything that we have to offer here at MSU. So what does that mean? So roles and responsibilities for colleges, units, and departments, so sort of like the overarching bodies, their responsibility is to ensure that the work environment, programs, course instructions, and events are accessible, and to implement reasonable workplace accommodations, which are set forth in a SEED, which is like an accommodation letter, but for an employee. But I know that this group is more instructors. So what are instructor responsibilities under this policy? So first and foremost, providing referrals to RCPD as necessary. So a lot of instructors will put something right in their syllabus about RCPD. If you feel like you need accommodations, here's how you contact RCPD to get assistance. Or sometimes this shows up, in where you see a student struggling and you may have a conversation with them and they say, well, in high school, I struggled with ADHD. And maybe they're just not aware that they can also receive accommodations for that here at MSU. So that's another way that we get referrals from instructors. Instructors are also responsible for ensuring that course instruction and materials are accessible. So there are some resources at the end of our presentation that we'll share that can really help if you feel like you need help figuring out how to make sure you're teaching in a way that's accessible to all of your students and that your materials are being provided in a format that works well for your students. The next one listed here is provide information to RCPD as requested. So that may look like a specialist reaching out to you, asking for your course syllabus or asking for you to explain, some aspect of your class, how a group work assignment is happening or expected for participation, or how something's graded, so that we can understand how we can accommodate the student without fundamentally altering the structure of the course. The next is implementing accommodations as granted by RCPD on the accommodation or the temporary adjustment letter. So those are changes that used to be called the visa or the vista, and we've recently changed that language. So when you receive a accommodation letter, to implement those accommodations. And then lastly, discuss any challenges or concerns after implementation. So, instructors are responsible for implementing accommodations as they're written until there's a discussion or until a change can be made. We also have linked at the bottom here this accommodation guidance PDF document that Shelby and then our ADA coordinator for the university, Tracy Leahy, came up with together. So that can be a really helpful resource too. You can go to the next slide, Shelby. Okay. So we wanted to share some disability prevalence information. I'm sure that you guys have noticed there are a lot more students who are registered and turning in accommodation letters and registering with disabilities. And we're definitely seeing that. So our graph that we have up here is a bar graph, and it's showing like our highest prevalence is of psychiatric disabilities at 1,815 students. Next would be learning disabilities at 1,700 students, and then it goes down. So from there, multiple disabilities, increase in chronic health disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and all the rest are listed there. This is from the 22-23 school year, so we haven't even updated these numbers for the increase that we've seen this year. So they're just a lot more students registering with all sorts of disabilities across campus. And this increase in accommodation needs is not unique to MSU. The World Health Organization reports a 25% increase in the global prevalence of anxiety and depression since the pandemic began. So that's an incredible increase. The CDC reports that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the prevalence of chronic health conditions. And we've also seen that more students registering with chronic health conditions in our office as well. Inside Higher Ed reported in May of 2022 about a significant increase in psychological and learning disabilities across universities. So again, we're definitely seeing that at MSU, but so is everybody else across the country. And RCPD has seen a nearly threefold increase in students self-identifying with our office since February 13th of last year. We have another bar graph here of the MSU disability population over time. So this goes all the way back to 1974, but you can see it was sort of a gradual, slow increase until about 2014 to 2021. It was pretty stable, around 1,500 to 1,800 students. And then in the last 21/22 school year that's on this graph, it's over 3,000 students. So we have seen a big increase in students registering. Thanks. Okay, so quick overview of how a student registers with our office. It's a 3-step process. It's the student's responsibility to self-identify. So sometimes students do that on their own. Sometimes their high school counselor will encourage them to contact the Disability Services office wherever they're going to college. Sometimes instructors will refer students to us, as we mentioned before, but the student has to initiate that process by self-identifying as a student for an employee with a physical, sensory, cognitive, or psychological disability. Then they submit documentation from a provider to, verify the condition and meet with a specialist to speak about accommodations. And then the student receives that accommodation letter that they send to you. So what do you do next? So you have a student in your class, they share an accommodation letter with you, formerly a visa. Some things that a specialist will recommend, trying to set up a meeting with the student or communicate over email if that's what they prefer, to discuss how accommodations will apply in your class. What needs need to be communicated, how, when, like for example here, how testing accommodations will work, what's the best way to contact the instructor if they're using an attendance or an extension related accommodation, through D2L, through email, through Teams, how do you prefer to get that information so it's in a timely fashion? Some students will say to me, I have extended testing time, but I met with my instructor and the test is all multiple choice. So I don't think I'm going to need to use that accommodation for that class. And that's fine. Implement the accommodation regardless of whether you think they are reasonable until you get clarification from the student specialist. So that's really important. Until you can have a conversation and, maybe there's some back and forth about, okay, why is this not reasonable for this class? Okay, well, what could we do instead? We should be implementing the accommodations as written. What if the student doesn't talk to you about their accommodation? You can reach out to the student to clarify any questions or concerns you have. Do the best to implement the accommodation as written, or if uncertain, the student specialist is listed on that letter as well. So if you need clarification, we're a good resource as well. What if you don't think an accommodation is reasonable or feasible? So you can reach out to the student specialist with concerns. So you may say, I don't think this accommodation is reasonable in my class, and here's why. In the meantime, as we said, implement the accommodation as written until you get clarification, or if you get a new accommodation letter from the student with that change made. And then there's a link here to our website talking about different accommodations. Okay, and I'm going to switch it over to Lindsay.
Hey everybody, Lindsay Hill, she, her pronouns. I have been working with the RCPD office for about 7 years now, and I primarily serve as a specialist working with autistic folks. So happy to be a resource in that arena as well. I'm going to take us into a little bit more nuanced direction. So now that we have the basics down, let's talk about some what about moving forward. So this slide about accommodation versus courtesy. So from time to time, it's important to know that a specialist may reach out on a student's behalf, or the student may reach out on their own and request a courtesy from an instructor. So this is something that's separate from an accommodation. And the reason is that it might go beyond the scope of an accommodation. And so it's really up to the instructor to determine whether or not they can provide that courtesy. So on the left, we've got accommodation, which is a tailored adjustments that levels the playing field, creates access for students where they previously may not have been, and it's required to be facilitated by instructors. It can't compromise the essential functions of the course or program. It's individually determined after a review of documentation provided by a licensed provider and an interactive discussion with the specialist. Those accommodations are for permanent conditions, and temporary adjustments are granted for temporary conditions and should also be honored. But a courtesy might be something that isn't on that list that a student is asking for, or they're asking for something to be implemented in a way that's not written as the accommodation. So an example of that might be the student has an accommodation for being able to turn in assignments late. but they did not reach out to their instructor before the assignment was due, which is a stipulation of the accommodation. And so basically the student might reach out as a courtesy and ask if it's still okay to turn that assignment in. So it differs from the accommodation because the accommodation's asking for it to be discussed ahead of time, but it's up to the instructor if they want to offer that courtesy. You may see something from a specialist asking for a courtesy or suggesting that you provide a courtesy. And that's because we've had some kind of conversation with the student. We understand what the impacts are. It's pretty rare that we would go into details about what is going on with the student because it's protected medical information. But we may have some more information that we can't really share out. So we might email the instructor and say, hey, we've been meeting with the student. We understand that this is a disability impact. We also understand that it's not an approved accommodation, but if you're able to make this courtesy, that would be great. But really in the end, it's up to the instructor. We know that a lot of courtesies were given after last February. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's maybe just for a different reason. Okay, next slide. So testing accommodations, we know that this can be a pain point for some instructors. We do have some guidance on our website around testing and classroom accommodations. Some units do find it helpful to maintain a list of rooms available for scheduling to help instructors find some spaces. RCPD has a limited amount of testing spaces, only 4, and these are for students with specific accommodation needs, such as assistive technology, readers, scribes, etc. We do have the MSU testing center that has spaces available. And can send proctors into units as well. So if a student has a reader scribe or needs a proctor for something, we can send that. But there is a charge there. Note that students cannot be charged for an accommodation. So this is the responsibility of the unit. So you can't put that $20 charge on the student or whatever the charge is. If cost for providing the accommodation is increasing in your unit, we do encourage you to identify this in your communications to administration. We have also convened a work group to bring awareness to administration of the challenges that departments and instructional staff are facing, with the goal of producing a final report by the end of December 2022. So keep that in mind. We are definitely not unaware of the challenges that faculty and departments are facing. Reader scribe needs are often managed with technology, so that's something to look into, but both can be provided in the classroom by having TAs or ULAs assist students. If no reader scribe is available for test or exams, students can request to test at RCPD. It's also important to know that, we know that providing accommodations can be very challenging. Our responsibility is to provide accommodations to the students that have registered. There's many factors that we cannot control, including how many students are admitted to the university each year, or how many students are allowed in each section or course. We do not allocate budgets or determine how many faculty or instructional staff, TAs, ULAs that a department can have, nor do we determine if courses can be offered online or in person or hybrid. We also do not determine accommodations based on quota. So students receive accommodations based on their condition and impact areas, not whether or not it will be easy to accommodate in a large lecture class. Even though we know that that's a pain point, we can't use that as our determination. So there's no way for us to reach a maximum number of a type of accommodation and stop giving it out once it's met. Accommodations are about leveling the playing field and not creating competition for who can receive the access first. Many of the questions we receive that we have received in the past about resources, we understand that this can be a pain point with some of these large lecture classes, having 3% or more of your students needing accommodations. And so again, be on the lookout for that final report as of December 2023, but we also encourage you to reach out to your units as well, or to the administration as well.
And Lindsay, can I jump in for just a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to also note, Mike Hudson and I, the director of RCPD, both went to the Council of Faculty and Academic Deans about 2 weeks ago and presented on this topic specifically about the need for providing more resources to colleges and units, about the challenges that faculty are facing around providing accommodations and the limited resources that are available, to make sure that administration is aware that this is an issue. Now, RCPD can't be the only ones that are making these requests and such, but wanted to just kind of put that out there, that in addition to this working group that we already have going, we have gone to the highest levels of administration that we can to get this message out, that the stark increase in the number of students registering is putting significant pressure on faculty, and more resources are needed to be allocated within units and departments across this campus.
Thanks, Shelby. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so communication in classes and events. This is just another type of accommodation consideration. We know that public speaking and interpersonal communication, group interactions can be particularly challenging for some people, depending on their condition. So trying to engage students to work to their strengths in these environments can be very helpful. Potentially consider alternatives to traditional presentations or question answer options. We do have some students with this particular accommodation that you will see. Students and employees are not required to share their accommodation letters with group mates or other students in the class. And instructors cannot disclose to group mates or other students. However, it can be helpful to have a discussion with a student that has an accommodation letter prior to establishing a group about how best to handle necessary accommodations while maintaining confidentiality. So again, this is one of those conversations to be had at that meeting when they produce their accommodation or send you their accommodation letter. Faculty could offer to help facilitate a conversation around expectations in the group, particularly in a flipped classroom environment. And also, please remember, you can always reach out to the RCPD specialist for these conversations as well. Consider providing notice consider providing people with notice for when they may be required to speak in class or a meeting. This can be really helpful for, folks with anxiety conditions or similar conditions. Just having the heads up and the notice might be useful and help them participate fully. Sometimes students may not be able to do that, even when they're given heads up. There might just be too much anxiety around that situation. Sometimes instructors have used or implemented like a nonverbal system, like maybe colored sticky notes or something, where if the student has a green sticky note on their computer, it means they're good to go. Feel free to call on me. I can do this today. Maybe a red sticky note says, I can't do it. So please don't call on me if you don't need to. But if it's some kind of a requirement for class participation, again, having that upfront information can be really helpful for those situations. This is, inobvious, but there's multiple ways to communicate. Please allow students to communicate in a format that's helpful and useful for them. Face-to-face communication may be very difficult for some, but creating a Google Doc or a text group where students can share ideas and foster collaboration and learning that might be a lot easier for some students, and allow them to contribute meaningfully. Try to work to the student's strengths. Not all students are great at presenting material, but some may be really good at researching data. Others may be good at speaking, and still others writing. So please empower students to creatively endeavor toward a workable solution for them. Next slide. Tips for accommodating all students. So these are just some basic things that we can think of here that you can put into place for everyone, and it will benefit those with disabilities as well. So share your notes or slides. So providing a copy of the material being presented, especially ahead of time, gives students the ability to follow along, lets them catch up if their condition impacts their functioning in class, provides memory aids for studying that can be very helpful, and also consider recording online classes if possible. Utilizing classroom technology. Some students with anxiety, attentional learning, or processing disorders can really struggle understanding verbal instructions. Often the ability to audio record lectures is helpful. That allows students to re-listen or go back as often as necessary to pick up information. Jumping down a couple, turning the captions on for online courses really helps those students who don't learn in that verbal manner to be able to see it. Many students do utilize assistive technology to help them with attentional and processing deficits. We're finding that students without accommodation letters are also requesting access to captioning for classes, as it helps with processing the material being discussed. It's very easy to turn on auto-generated captions, and it can be very helpful for students. Students could also do this on their own if it's not something, even for an in-person class. There is technology that students can use on their own devices that they can gather the captions, as long as you're using the microphone systems in the classroom so that the audio can be picked up. Provide clear, concise verbal and written guidelines for assignments. And also consider consolidating content management systems. So we've had a lot of reports of students having multiple content management systems. It can be very confusing to manage. A lot of them can be inaccessible. So please try to critically evaluate the need for individual content management systems and services provided. And if there are more accessible options, please consider those. Yeah, next slide. Sorry, I'm trying to go fast, but also can't go fast. Thinking of some trauma-informed practices, some things that you can do: give brief stretching or rest breaks in classes. This can be very helpful for students to manage their conditions, interrupt some trauma responses, and it is a common accommodation given for multiple conditions. Provide those content warnings for known emotionally challenging or triggering content. This may include information related to sexual assault, domestic and or child abuse, racism, racial trauma, war and political conflict, natural disasters, etc. If you notice a student struggling with the content in class, consider giving a break for the whole class. This can interrupt that trauma response without calling out a single individual. It also allows students that may be silently struggling that you may not notice to practice compensatory grounding strategies. Recognize that timed assessments can activate a student's anxiety or trauma response. Test anxiety on its own is not a disability under the ADA. However, there are other forms of anxiety and learning disabilities that can manifest with severe test anxiety. Many students find their minds go blank. They start shaking. It takes some time to recover to be able to adequately focus. It's true even if they've properly prepared or studied for the test or exam. Evaluate the use and need for pop quizzes. These are often anxiety provoking for many students with and without accommodations. What educational purpose does it serve for that specific course? And is there a way for students to demonstrate mastery of the knowledge in other ways? Language matters. Speaking of language mattering, am I the only one that's not seeing captions correctly?
Yeah, they have not been working well.
Definitely did not say Xbox.
Yeah.
I don't know if Danielle, if you can kind of look into that, perhaps.
Yes, we're looking into it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, this is just best practices. Believe people that they have a need for accommodations. Create an atmosphere of encouragement and validation. If you question a student's need for accommodations, you are sending a message that disabilities are not real. People with disabilities cannot be successful in college, or maybe even that the student does not actually have the disability. Even the most accessible, universally designed classes there can still be a need for individual accommodations. I think that's sometimes misunderstood. We, encourage the use of universal design, but also you have to notice that sometimes students with individuals have other unique conditions or specific impacts that may still require accommodations. So universal design does have the potential to reduce the number of individual accommodations that a professor has to make in the class, but we still might need some individual accommodations in addition. Promote an open and honest dialogue around accommodations and what an individual student might need. We recommend meeting with the student, as we've said in the past, to discuss their accommodations and how they might be implemented. This can be very helpful for both the student and the faculty, so there's no surprises later on about expectations. Be open to meeting throughout the semester as needs to discuss ongoing needs as well. And then the last point is just to consider the power differentials at play between faculty and students. I'm sure you're all aware of that, but asking students for information about their condition violates their private medical condition and puts pressure on them to comply. So when you ask them the question, they might feel pressured to answer that. Students do not have to provide an explanation beyond their stated accommodations and are not required to share information on their medical documentation. So that all is housed with the RCPD. You can ask about accommodations without asking about the conditions and why they're warranted. Next slide. I think I'm going to hand it off to Shelby here.
My turn. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about course and event descriptions. I used to do this back when I worked in the College of Natural Science Dean's office. I did some of this, so I get how these kind of work a little bit and how they can, some of the information can hide, and how you send in the information and how you send it in was great and how it appears is not. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that for a minute. But it's really important that we ensure that our courses in Campus Solutions and any events that you're scheduling that students or employees are attending, the dates and times are clearly labeled. This is also really important on syllabi that you're putting out, that dates are clearly articulated in there. Make any necessary corrections, especially when it comes to spacing, when the published course listings come out, if you still have that ability. That spacing information makes sure that students can see necessary information, like when exams are to be administered. And then sometimes that exam information can be hidden under the class notes, which is not always easily accessible to students. And so we will sometimes get students that are enrolled in a course that do not realize that the exam is held at a different time. And that can create some issues, especially if there are condition or medication impacts that happen around a designated sort of time frame. And so if an exam is held in the evening for a student, then that can be a problem. If every class for a particular program is set up that way, that's going to create a problem for every student in the program that has a particular condition or impact like that. We do give students that are registered with RCPD access to priority enrollment so that they can self-accommodate into courses that best fit their specific situation. The purpose of doing this is to allow them to enroll in the classes that they need without having to come to RCPD for additional accommodations, without having to maybe enlist their advisor around, hey, this is the type of classes that I need because of my condition. But it's really important that with that priority enrollment that they know what they're enrolling in. So that's why the having accurate information is really important on the course descriptions. Not just the expectations in the class, but format and structure as well. Students that have communication impacts, like Lindsay was talking about, might not do as well in a flipped lecture type classroom, things like that, or might not do as well in a group work based classroom. If that information is put in the course description, then they can enroll in a different section that might not have that. And then we don't have to adjust accommodations quite as much, and we don't have to work with faculty as much. Faculty don't have to come to us as much. It creates an easier structure all around. Creating an accessible syllabus. I talked about this a little bit before, event agenda documents, things like this. Microsoft Accessibility Checker has all the information in there. You can do this on your own. We're going to have some resources at the end of this as well, but it's really important that the structure of the syllabi are set up in such a way that students can read it, organizing it using headers and spacers for screen readers, and also so that students can the text is broken up so students can find and read the important information. For classes with multi-date events, making sure that the dates and material, the dates that materials will be covered, as well as due dates, help students follow along and get organized. That clear, concise language that we talked about earlier is really important in the syllabus as well. Sometimes you will see that on an accommodation letter because it's extremely important for students that we're not ambiguous in the instructions, especially if we are referring students back to that syllabus for instructions on how to do their work. We want to make sure that it's very clear. And then descriptive alternative text descriptions of images and tables. Many students use screen readers. Many people on this campus use screen readers. And so accessing their information is incredibly important to make sure that we have accurate descriptions in those. I will say that I have worked here at MSU for a long time in a couple of different areas, and it can be very challenging to sit down with a student and try to help them with a syllabus. And I can't find the information myself in there. So trying to help an incoming first or second year student figure out how when their homework is due or what they need to do can be very challenging. So having somebody that's not responsible for teaching a class look over it can be really helpful about, hey, could you pull this information out? If you were not teaching this class, right? We can't edit our own work sometimes. So if you have somebody else take a look at it, to just say, is this information something that you could pull out if you didn't know where to look, can be really helpful. And then going over assignments verbally in class, instead of just referring to the syllabus, can be very helpful. If a student is struggling to understand that syllabus, if they can't pull the information they need out of the content there, having that verbal information can be really helpful as well. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about accessibility as a DEI practice as well. We talked about this in our last presentation, but we'll talk about it here too. Power and privilege can create barriers to access, right? If a student cannot approach the faculty to say that they have access needs, they're not going to get their access needs met. Individuals with intersecting identities, multiply marginalized students and employees, they hold identities in multiple groups. If they are, sorry, I lost my place in my notes. Multiply marginalized individuals are those who, in addition to being disabled, hold intersecting identities in another group, including marginalized genders, races, ethnicities, sexualities, and other economic backgrounds. We want to make sure that we are addressing how we structure our courses, our processes, our policies in a way that is inclusive of all backgrounds, including accessibility. This should not be an afterthought. Having captions available, as we've talked about, using multiple formats for materials, reviewing spaces for access, having a quiet space to retreat for those that might need it, clear guidance on policies and expectations, that trauma-informed lens, and being aware of the language that we use and its impacts, not just around disability, but around everything. Accessibility is viewing disability needs through an inclusive lens instead of minimal compliance, which I think is an area that we tend to do on this campus a lot, right? We talk about what we have to do to be compliant, and that is important. That's legally what we have to do, but it's also something that we should want to do because it's a DEI practice. Disability inclusion is part of MSU strategic plan. So it's really important that we're including this into our practices and policies, evaluating the quote why behind the practices that we have in place. Is it just because we've always done it that way, or is this something that we can critically evaluate the need for to determine? This slide around equality, accommodation, and accessibility is just a really helpful kind of diagram about what this is. How does the one size fits all approach look, in an equality approach treats everybody equally regardless of their needs. That first panel, equality is everybody is treated the same. So the individual, there's 3 individuals, one person tall enough to reach the chalkboard, one person mostly tall enough to reach the chalkboard and kind of has to stretch, and one person that is a chair user unable to reach it all. Accommodation is the process where we provide the accommodations. An individual is given a step stool, they can reach the chalkboard better. The individual in a wheelchair is given a ramp, they can now reach the chalkboard. That's the accommodation process. That's how we provide equity within the experience. But accessibility is evaluating how do we change the environment itself to make it equitable for all. It's the practice of making our information, activities, or environments sensible, meaningful, and usable for as many people as possible. So that third panel is the chalkboard itself is lowered so everybody can use it equitably without need for any additional accommodation. I just like this one. I think it's a great explanation of how equality, accommodation, and accessibility is an inclusive practice. So it's just a really good illustration of that I thought. And then I think it's really important to define and recognize ableism just in the context of talking about accessibility and, the work that we do on campus. These are 2 different definitions of ableism that we really like. The first one is a simpler form. Ableism is a form of discrimination that treats non-disabled people as the quote standard to which all others are held. It can take the form of ideas and assumptions, stereotypes, attitudes, and practice, physical barriers in the environment, or larger scale oppression. This next part I bolded, it is often unintentional and most people are completely unaware of the impact of their words or actions. So going back to that idea that the language that we use really matters. It's this idea that we as individuals are the standard by which all others should be judged, spilling out into everything that we do, right? But this other definition, the second definition, is one that I also really like. And it's Talia Lewis. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and quote, behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. That's a very powerful definition as well when we're looking at how we as an environment on this campus and students might be experiencing ableism and disability in this environment. Additional resources for support. We've linked a few areas out here. Our website is the top resource that we've linked. There's a lot of information on that website. Lots of resources available on our website and lots of areas to go to. If you have questions about accommodations, our standard accommodations, that are more common accommodations, are on the website with detailed explanations about how to implement different scenarios, student responsibilities, faculty responsibilities. So when in doubt, you can always go to our website. I know oftentimes faculty are up working on classroom issues, concerns, questions, answering student questions late into the evening or on the weekends. And so if you can't reach a specialist here in the office or the specialist is busy, our calendars are often very full, sometimes 2 to 3 weeks out. So if you can't reach somebody, the website is a really great resource to getting a hold of, to getting some basic information on a specific accommodation. MSU's web accessibility site is another great resource that's out there. MSU's testing center, students can be scheduled up in the testing center and will be scheduled up in the testing center if they are referred to RCPD for testing accommodations or accommodated tests that are either not eligible to actually test here or our spaces are full and we can't put them in. Or on occasions, we'll have some faculty that will refer all of their students with accommodated testing to RCPD. That is not the purpose of RCPD testing spaces, and we'll refer them up to the testing center. And that is a billable service. The testing center will get billed back, or will bill back to the unit. So it's really important to have those conversations around how to provide those testing accommodations like we talked about earlier. Or you can work with the testing center about having a proctor brought out if you need to, those kinds of things. Nathan James is the director, and he's really a very helpful resource. Creating accessible documents, AbilityNet, the Trauma Services and Training Network, TSCN, they're a really great resource on trauma-informed practices. And then the Duke Accessible Syllabus Project is a great resource for creating accessible everything, more than just your syllabus, but lots of different avenues for accessibility at that link. I'm going to stop share because we're got to the end of the slideshow and we still have a few minutes available for questions.
Thank you so much, Shelby, Tessa, and Lindsay. If anyone would like to ask a question, please go ahead and either raise your hand or feel free to put that in the chat. Okay, and if I do say your name wrong, please correct me. Ayla?
Aaliyah.
Thank you. Elia.
Yeah, no problem. There's 3 vowels. It's really unfair. So my question is about the assisted reader technology and compatibility with like D2L and Respondus and things like that. So I teach a fully online course, and I don't like to use, lockdown browser and things like that, just because I think it sets the tone for, I believe that students are going to cheat. But I'm curious about how these technologies interact with those other interfaces, just in case I do have to use something. Is there a resource to kind of learn about that?
You want me to talk about that, Shelby? Okay. Yeah, I was like, is someone else going to talk? Okay. Anyways, hi, Aaliyah. Thank you for your question. So yeah, like, I feel like it was sort of multiple parts. So D2L is very accessible with a screen reader. So many of my students who use screen readers can have no problems accessing D2L. Respondus specifically does not work with a screen reader. So what I have done is said that, like, if I have a student in a class who uses Respondus or a lockdown browser, I'll just communicate with the instructor that they can't do that, or else they literally can't take the test. I'm not aware. I know there are other screen readers like Read and Write or Kurzweil that we use, and I don't think that they work with Respondus or lockdown browser, but I don't know that for sure. I'm just assuming that since JAWS doesn't work with it. We have an assistant director for assistive technology here in our office, Tyler Smeltikop. So if you had specific questions about a specific class or test or type of lockdown browser with a certain software, you could definitely direct those questions to him.
Another option too would be to do for an individual student using a screen reader would be to do Zoom proctoring if you had an online exam. We've had faculty do that before. And so that's another avenue in those kind of settings. And we have been in communication with Respondus and lockdown browser, other lockdown browsers that are commonly used, but Respondus, I think, is the most commonly used one that we hear about the fact that it's not accessible for screen readers. And hopefully it's something that will be worked on, but it is something that we and other institutions, we're not the only ones that have raised that it is a concern.
Thank you. Katie?
Sorry, I'll lower my hand. I have sort of a specific question. I teach physics classes on campus, and one thing that we worked on as a group with our materials last year, the year before, was to increase font size on a lot of our materials, and also increase the amount of space that was available for students for writing, since they often have to then turn in materials, so for grading, like within a certain space. One thing I've noticed is I think that this causes some tension because it creates like really big packets of things then. So it seems like because it increases the length, the overall length or the number of pages, I guess, in a packet. And that can feel really stressful for students. I think when I hand them like, we're going to work on this, or this is your homework set or something, and it's like 15 pages long instead of like 6 or something. I didn't know if you had any suggestions for that. Like one thing specifically is, I think based on the recommendation from someone else, that the font size is now like 14 points on a number of those activities. Like, would there be a reason to have like 2 versions? I'm just like, I feel like there's this tension between wanting it to be like visually accessible and have enough space, and also having people feel like high anxiety around so much to look at once.
Sure. Is there a reason that, I mean, like maybe you could provide the information digitally and then students could choose to print it or, access it on their computer, change the font to a size that works for them, increase the spacing as they need it. So then if a student does, want to print it out, but they can have it in small font and they can handwrite in a smaller area.
So we do have that. I guess I don't emphasize, we do give a digital version and a printed version depending on what people want. So maybe I don't usually mention that for folks. Like, you can change the Word document however you would like to some degree or something. I haven't.
Yeah, you could just say like, we've increased the font and given this extra space in case people need it. If you don't need that space, then feel free to take that out of there to reduce the number of pages or whatever.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kanchan.
Hi, thank you. I have one question. Students with, excuse me, like a temporary condition, could be a broken leg, morning sickness, would they be able to come to you to get help and accommodations?
Yeah, we were, sorry, Tessa, I jumped in there before you did.
It's okay.
We do work with temporary conditions. They're issued a temporary accommodation letter, formerly called a VISTA. And then you mentioned morning sickness. Those are pregnancy related accommodations that's handled in conjunction with our office and the Title IX office. So all of which still work with Tessa. So you're very popular today, Tessa. But but yes, we work with those conditions as well.
Yep. And oftentimes I was just going to add on those temporary accommodation letters. If a student has just a standard permanent condition, their accommodation letter might be good for the whole year. It might be good for 4 years until their anticipated graduation date. So if it's temporary, you just want to check for that expiration date. And then as like, I work with a lot of students who have like broken an arm or they have surgery on their hand or something. And so as they're recovering, that end date might change, and I'll just send them an updated temporary letter that they'll just provide you with another copy.
Another thing that you might see, we use temporary adjustment letters or temporary letters to help students that are struggling with getting access to documentation. So we will provide them with temporary adjustments for equity purposes, and then connect them with resources on campus. So those are students that are likely to present with a permanent condition later on, but because of struggles with access to healthcare providers and things like that, we are providing them with temporary adjustments initially to get them the access they need in their classes. Lots of different types of access here we're talking about, but to get them what they need in their classes, and then we'll update that with a permanent accommodation letter later on.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand? Okay. Oh, we have one more. Rachel, go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry if there's time. I think I was hoping maybe for some guidance on a specific accommodation. The one that I feel like I struggle with the most is the please provide student with clear, concise, and detailed verbal and written course guidelines or directions for assignments and projects. And what I've been doing is just when students have that accommodation, kind of inviting them, I meet with them and say, if things don't seem clear, can you please, reach out to me and let me know. But I don't know if there's a better way, or that one is just the hardest to me, because sometimes what I think is clear like isn't clear, and so any help would be appreciated.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best ways to go about it, is to offer to meet with students and clear things up. But I would say that the majority of people are already providing very clear, concise written directions. There are some folks that don't, that just have sort of a verbal like, hey, we're going to work on this and this is how we're going to do it, and they don't really write it down so much. And so that can be very challenging for some of our students. And so that's where one of those accommodations might come into play. I would say most people are probably already doing this, but you can always offer like, hey, I already put, all of the instructions on this Word document in D2L, whatever it is, with clear instructions. But if you're having any trouble interpreting those, please come and see me. Yeah. So I think you're doing the right thing.
Thank you. Glad you asked that question, Rachel. Oh, well, we're at time, so I don't want to invite any more, but I'm sure that they are available to answer more questions. And I really want to thank Shelby, Lindsay, and Tessa for coming to NatSci for a second time. We did have an earlier session in August with some of the NatSci Dean's Office leadership, chairs and directors, and undergraduate program directors. So total, this has been a great opportunity, and we really appreciate you and look forward to continuing to connect with you. So thank you all.
Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you for having us and having us
Thanks,
back.
everybody.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Bye.